If you're doing automated vulnerability scanning with Burp using Burp's Active Scanner, an extension I'm definitely going to recommend you look into is Pentagrid Scan Controller by Tobias Osbelt. This is an extension that ultimately is designed to make your scanning more efficient by focusing on requests that are likely to actually yield interesting results that are worth scanning. So let's start by looking at the kind of default behavior of Burp's scanner. So if you're like me, probably a lot of the way that you approach using Burp's Active Scanner during an engagement is you go through sets of functionality as you encounter them and add them to the scanner, trying to make sure that there's good coverage provided. But it's very possible in the course of this to send requests to Burp for scanning that are really not going to be interesting and is going to result in a lot of scan traffic that is unnecessary. And as an example here, I've taken this request to this SVG image. So this is a static image. We can look at the response in Burp to see that it's an image, and it's not likely something that is processing interesting inputs. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be any vulnerability here, but in most situations, there's nothing very interesting about this request that you're probably going to, you're probably not going to find interesting results from running an active scan. So if I scan this right now, I'll start a new scan. I just want to audit it, and we can go look at the requests from the scanner. And many of the payloads used by Burp, when it first processes a request, clearly it's looking for different injection points to send its payloads to. And one of the ways in which this is probably very inefficient when you're scanning an entire application is for a lot of these components. And again, this isn't universally true, but a lot of the case, if you're injecting into cookies, there's probably shared logic in the application that is processing the value of those cookies. There's probably not some, custom handler that is based on, the path of the request that you're sending. So it's probably very inefficient every time you do a scan to look at this, but send payloads in each of these cookie values. And again, not universally true, right? So it's always good to get a good understanding of your application, how it works, and if there are any interesting requests that you identify, they might be worth scanning in totality. But a lot of this, I think, interesting findings that Burp Scanner yields are ultimately going to be similar findings that it would find scanning other functionality. And a lot of this stuff right here, where it's kind of anything it's injecting into like a query string is going to be very uninteresting in this case, because again, we're making a static a request to a static resource, and this is one of the main motivations behind this tool that we're going to look at. That if we're doing scanning throughout an engagement, it'll be most efficient if we exclude scanning resources that are not going to be interesting. And secondarily, another motivation was that scanning should not provide a false sense of coverage by scanning something and failing silently, right? So another situation that you might run into, and I don't have a perfect example open here, but you might have a situation where for a request to succeed, there has to be some unique condition in that request, and that condition either changes over time. So for example, the expiration of session tokens, cookies, or maybe there's just even some time value that's baked into that request and it becomes stale, or maybe you need to send a unique value in a certain parameter. And all of these cases, you'll send a request when you're actually walking through the application manually that's going to succeed. But if you just sent that to the scanner is not clever enough to know that the subsequent responses indicate that the request is not actually being properly processed. Now, that doesn't mean that by scanning it, you won't yield vulnerabilities, but often you're going to be getting much less coverage from the scan when you're scanning that type of resource where the requests are not producing valid responses. So the secondary motivation for this tool was to identify where requests are actually repeatable, right? The idea is if you make a request once and it yields a certain response, to be able to scan that, you should see a similar response from subsequent requests. And anything that deviates from that likely indicates some failure of a condition where that request is not getting processed or not having the full impact on that application that it normally would. So in comes Pentagrid Scan Controller, which is the extension that we are looking at in this video. It provides a large number of options that are probably very overwhelming at first. Quite simply, the scanner works by toggling this on to scan as you browse an application. That's all it is, right? So you turn the application on, and you don't even need to think about the settings to get going with it. Now, granted, by understanding how it works, you're going to definitely yield the best results if you are making modifications to it in consideration of how your application works. But you can just come in here into the settings, turn on proxy requests, take a look at the output of the tool or the log of it, and then you can scroll or you can browse the application. And as you browse, the tool is going to look at the traffic that goes through proxy, the proxy in Burp, and it's going to identify what it thinks is interesting and worth scanning, and it's going to scan those. And it's going to use some of its own logic for the scans, and it's also going to, in the situation where it tries a request and it doesn't get the same response that you did when you were simply browsing the application, there is some logic built into the tool to try and see if there is a way around that. So this tool requires another extension to be installed, an extension that we'll look at in another series called Hackverter. And the reason for that is it uses some of the functionality from Hackverter to inject different values to see, for example, if there's a parameter that needs to be unique on every request, can it just automate identifying that process? So if it can't repeat a request, it will try to figure out a way to repeat that request and scan it. So all you need to do is browse through the app, and you'll be populating all of these scans. In the tool, we use its logic, which of course is adjustable to determine what to scan and what not to scan. So let's look at the log real quickly from just that quick browse of the application. You'll see that we have a number of URLs here that have been seen from the proxy. One of the additional benefits of this tool is it also, to reduce the scanner traffic, it looks for duplicates, so it won't do a duplicate scan of an existing URL. And obviously, there are going to be problems and limitations to this. So you might have an application that has not implemented URL-based routing to determine what functionality is called. There might be some other mechanism that the tool does not see. Maybe it's a header that indicates a function name or something like that. So the usefulness of this tool is obviously going to vary just as much as applications vary substantially, right? So you just need to have a good understanding of how the tool works, when it may not be working as you think it is, what the limitations are, and quite helpfully, it does give us a lot of details in the log here, right? So it shows us the URLs that it's seen, it shows us the status codes that it's seen, whether it made the decision to actually scan it or not, and it uses this interesting score that it computes to feed into whether it's actually going to scan something. So for example, if I go to the options here, we can look at some of the settings that we can control. You can define uninteresting file extensions. And in this example, we have by default SVG built in, right? So if we came across an SVG image, I'm not sure if we made a request to one, but it will see that as uninteresting because it's defined as an uninteresting, static type, probably not worth scanning in most cases. Additionally, when assessing the repeatability of the request and determining whether or not a request should be scanned, it gives you a bit of logic here, so you can kind of understand why the tool came to the decision that it came to. And it also shows you its modifications, if any, to the original request, which unfortunately we don't have really interesting results here to show off. So let's take a quick look at the options, because these are very important, obviously, to configure your tool. I think the most reasonable setup is to have it proxy have it take requests from the proxy. You can also configure it to scan things that you send in repeater, but I think it makes more sense to browse the application and queue up items that way. Of course, I think very important in probably all cases to restrict scanning to in-scope items. It lets you define a delay from time of seeing a request to when it's actually going to scan it. It also lets you set a number of hard exclusions. So these are the exclusions, what is not going to get included? What is a hard no? One example is never scan uninteresting HTTP methods. What makes an HTTP method uninteresting? Well, we can actually define those if you scroll down further to the detailed settings, uninteresting things, and interesting as well. Here it's decided that options is uninteresting, and I would say that this isn't always the case, right? So it's important to know what the tool is restricting in order to make it more efficient, because you're going to want to probably make sure, you're going to definitely want to make sure that you're providing adequate coverage of anything that the tool might be excluding. You can also tinker with the interesting score settings. I haven't played around with this too much. I'm usually more interested in tinkering with these settings here, determining what is interesting and what is uninteresting, as that varies substantially from application to application. You can also tinker with the settings for repeatability, right? What is it attempting to do to make a request that is not repeatable, right? So it can't get a response that is similar enough to what you originally received. What is it going to try in order to try and get that type of response? And of course, also the repeatability section here is going to define the parameters around what does it determine as repeatable, right? And it gives you some interesting things to play with. For example, there's no perfect way to identify when a response is functionally equivalent to another one, because there are so many elements of an HTTP response that might vary from request to request when still they've ultimately had the same outcome, or the parameters have been processed in the same way, right? There could be a header that returns the date. And so if you're looking at a strict comparison of response to response, like you're hashing the response data and comparing the hash values, you might never see a match just because of changes to values of dates or other components like CSRF tokens. So one of the metrics that is used in the analysis of is this response similar is looking at a percentage difference in response length. And that's obviously going to vary application to application. And you might have some weird application that has a randomly sized object that's being returned in a response that causes similar responses to nonetheless deviate by more than 15%. So that might be a value that you want to adjust. So those are all the settings. That's how the tool works. I think it's a really nifty tool. You can, with any tool, of course, look in Logger to see what exactly is being scanned, which is always good. Regardless of what tool you're using, it's good to take a look at what is being logged and audit the requests that are being sent. Not only just to make sure that it's working and to see what it's deciding to scan and how those things are being scanned, but also because it can be valuable to look at the responses, see what the tool is causing the application to do, because you might identify some weird behavior that is worth looking into, even though the scanner didn't flag it explicitly as a vulnerability. So that's Pentagrid Scan Controller. I highly recommend you take a look at it. And of course, as with any scanning tool of this nature, of course, keep in mind that it's going to be sending a lot of malicious traffic to your application. So make sure, obviously, that you are permitted to do so.